Hello again. One of the many subjects about which I am not an expert is the supply of energy to people's businesses and homes. I remember when fracking shales seemed likely to provide us with cheap gas and as much as we wanted, but it was stopped as being environmentally unfriendly and likely to cause global warming. Instead, we now import shale gas from Qatar in the Middle East. This is apparently far more environmentally sound. The Qataris do the fracking in Arabia, and then they liquefy the gas and transport it all the way to Britain using diesel-powered ships so that we can burn it here. Similarly, we stopped digging up coal and burning it to generate electricity, and instead we now buy trees which have been chopped down in primeval forests in Lithuania and have been shipped over here so that we can burn them in our power stations. Again, it's seemingly better for the planet. While we sit on almost limitless amounts of coal which need only to be dug up from the ground, we are instead importing the stuff from Kazakhstan, which is 3,000 miles away. When all this net zero carbon business began, we were assured that our energy would be far cheaper if we relied upon renewables. It was obvious, surely. What's the point in burning oil and paying for electricity and gas when we can just generate as much electricity as we want from windmills and solar panels? The only thing is, the more that we generate our electricity in this way, from environmentally sound sources, the more expensive it seems to be. This is a strange state of affairs. This year is going to be catastrophic for fuel bills, as I'm sure everybody knows, and there's every possibility that we will end the year paying twice as much for our electricity as we currently are. Part of the problem is that electricity is very hard to store in large amounts. That's fine if you're running a power station. If the demand for electricity drops a bit, you can similarly produce less, and then you just turn up your capacity when demand increases. If you're operating windmills and the national grid doesn't need all the electricity you're producing, then you have to turn off your turbines so that the system doesn't get overloaded. Then the government has to pay you as though you were still producing electricity, these so-called constraint payments. In that way, by the way, in the course of the last year, these companies running the windmills were paid nearly £300 million not to generate electricity. That's one of the reasons why your bills have gone up lately, of course. What happens if it's cold and the wind isn't blowing? Then we need to switch on gas-fired power stations, of course. Those burning the gas that we are not allowed to drill for ourselves but have to import from the Middle East. Funny, no? The odd thing about all this is, and of course it goes hand in hand with having to scrap all petrol-driven cars and do away with gas cookers, is that you might expect it from the Liberals or even the Labour Party, but it is really not what you would think a Conservative government would be doing. It's all very unpopular, but for some inexplicable reason the government is hell-bent on pushing it all through regardless. Older people would have known perfectly well that this was never going to work out as a cheaper option for those paying the bills. The older you get, the more you see the same patterns repeating themselves. And I can certainly see this with the idea of cheap electricity. You will remember that this was a hook used to draw people into supporting the renewable energy scheme in the first place. It would be better for the planet, of course, but best of all, it would save everybody money, because sunshine and wind are free, aren't they? Sounds good. It may have sounded as though it made perfect sense, but I can remember when the same promise was made about electricity generated by nuclear energy. The promise then was that electricity would produced in this way would be so cheap there'd be no point anymore in electricity meters. It would be too cheap to bother with such things. Of course, that wasn't how it worked out, and I never heard that anybody actually had lower bills once the nuclear plants started turning out electricity for us. In a way, not being an expert makes it easier to understand things like this, which look very complicated at first sight. The one thing I know with assurance is that electricity bills must rise rather than fall. That has always been the case for over a century now, and there's no earthly reason it would change now. The question is whether they will rise quickly or slowly. Well, since we know that the cost of everything is going to rise steeply over the next few years, as the inflation created by the government chucking around money like a drunken sailor on shore leave begins to kick in, the answer to that question is that bills for electricity, gas, water, petrol and all the other things we use will be rocketing up. This is the marvellous thing about not being an economist or expert on electricity production. You can see more clearly what's going to happen without worrying about the fine print. Of course, if the government wanted to, they could bring bills down again at once by opening coal mines and extracting gas from the North Sea and by fracking, but that simply isn't going to happen. We're best prepared to tighten our belts this year.